Welcome everyone back to our third of 4 sessions in our adult Sunday school class entitled Gender and Sexuality. I want to remind everyone that in this series, our goal is to educate ourselves about gender and sexuality and dispel myths and misconceptions and become better allies with our LGBTQ+ friends and family. This class will help us to be better gender inclusive followers of Christ. In today's session, we'll review our agreement, and then Sylvia will offer a prayer, and we'll go right into this week's presentation from Carol Wise. Carol will follow with a Q&A, and then we'll close with a preview for next week's class. I want to just remind you that we ask that you ask questions and approach with curiosity, that you have an open mind and an open heart. Please welcome discomfort. It's what happens when we learn and unlearn. Speak from your experience, tell your own story, and remember that you might not know everything about everyone in the room or their friends or family. And like every other arena at Portland Mennonite, this is a no judgment zone. And all of us who are presenting or supporting this class are available for offline conversations. If you like, we are Levon Blowers, myself, Lois, Chris Bargu, Van Gerber, and Sylvia Shirk. In addition, at the end of next week's session, we'll be sending out a questionnaire to hear what your feedback is and to plan for subsequent sessions if there is interest. And I want you to know that we are recording this program, just the presentation, not any of your commentary or questions after the presentation. And so those are available on our website. Kurt puts them up pretty much the very same day. So, so look forward to that. In today's session, we have a very special guest speaker, Carol Wise. She's the director of the Brethren Mennonite Council for LGBTQ Interest, an organization that has been working with LGBTQ justice within the Mennonite Church and Church of the Brethren for more than 45 years. I just want to say thank you, Carol, for 45 years of that service. She's a graduate of Illes School of Theology in Denver. She lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she can enjoy the great pleasures of cross-country, snowshoeing, and frigid walks. So now Sylvia will lead a prayer, and then we'll go right into our presentation with Carol.
Join me in praying. And as we pray, I'm giving thanks for Carol and her many years of service to the MC community, and pray God's blessing as you bring a close to that work soon to move on to something else. Thank you, thank you. Praying together. Come, Holy Spirit, enter our silences. Come, Holy Spirit, into the depths of our longing. Come, Holy Spirit, unmask our pretending. Enter our trusting, enter our fearing, enter our letting go, enter our holding back. Come, Holy Spirit, embrace and free us. Amen.
Well, first, I wanted to say thank you for this invitation and for the chance to be with you this morning. I just want to affirm the work that you've done and the directions that you're taking. I think this whole movement of LGBTQ justice is such a gift, particularly to the larger church, in terms of broadening our ability to be fully authentic, to explore our theology and how it relates to the world, and to be able to really understand and be with each other in a deeper and more authentic way. So I think it's a true gift, and I'm so glad that you're doing this work. So this morning, my task is to talk a little bit about gender identity, and I'll be using some of the slides that have been prepared by Jane and James Mast that the committee wanted used, and then just sort of add some commentary and ideas as I go along. So one thing you should know is that this whole piece about gender identity in this morning's conversation will include a lot of definitions and terms. It's kind of a fast-moving area. Terms are changing. Some of the concepts are changing as we grow in our understanding. So just hang with it. And I think the thing that's really nice to know about that is there's lots more to learn and lots more growth to happen. So let's start with the slide, and Rod has graciously agreed to do the technical part. Okay, and let's go to the next slide, and then the next one. Okay, so gender identity is kind of an interesting term. It's sort of one of those things that we almost intuitively think we understand and have a deep sense of what it's about. But then the more we sort of get into it, the more we realize it's actually kind of hard to define, and it's complex. So when I think of gender identity, gender identity is our sort of deeply internal sense of how we see and understand ourselves as sort of embodied individuals, like how we experience our sense of being male or female or man or woman or both or neither, maybe changing. One thing that we have come to learn about our gender identity is that it's something that develops at a fairly young age, generally about age 3. And it's something that we carry with us and might change and move as we go through life. The other piece about gender is that there's it's also sort of a highly social construct. In our society, we gender so many things, almost all of our experiences. So for example, I think about, I went to buy a baby present for our neighbor. So the next time you go into a store and look at like children's clothes or even baby clothes, one thing you realize right away is how gendered it is. And the first thing that if you ask for assistance, the clerk will ask is it a boy or is it a girl, right? And then depending on what you say, you're directed to kind of one end of the shelf or the other end of the shelf, and things are there's often different colors involved, with pinks and yellows for girls and blues and browns for boys. And these are just little babies, right? That have no real sense of gender, and yet we begin automatically to pile a lot of things on. And we have studies have been done, and it has been shown, often to the surprise of people, that we treat babies and toddlers and children very, very differently, depending upon whether we think they are a boy or a girl. And in our society, there are only two choices. So for example, in one study, They had young children. You really couldn't. There's nothing defining their sex, and but they put the child in, say, a pink outfit and handed them to someone and asked them to play with that child for 20 minutes. So those children who had on a pink kind of outfit, the adults who were interacting with them handed that child things like a soft stuffed animal, talked with them in particular tones, and interacted with them in a particular way. Likewise, they were given a child who was maybe dressed in blue. They tended to hand them things like balls and things that had spatial identity pieces and talk to them in a different way. The only thing was, and they felt that they were being very gender neutral. The thing was, at the end of that study, they said, well, actually, that child in the pink is a boy, and the child in the blue was a girl, and the people were very surprised because they realized the way they had responded to their expectations of what it means to be a girl child or a boy child. So we really gender from a very young age, and it has consequences when you consistently hand a child something that has to do with sort of spatial designs and balls and things that move. It shifts the how their brain is shaped. Likewise, if you hand a child soft things all the time that maybe don't require much problem solving, that shapes how their brain is formed. So there's a biological component to that as well. But when you think about our culture and the ways that we gender, and again, we tend to have just two genders, male or female, or men or women. We realize like toys are incredibly highly gendered. Our clothing is highly gendered in terms of like what we wear and how it's textured and the utility of it. We gender emotions. We say things like, well, men don't cry. Men aren't supposed to cry. That's because somehow crying we relate it to gender. Girls or women aren't supposed to be aggressive because that's not a feminine type of emotion. So our emotions are gendered. We gender careers in terms of what men are supposed to do and women are supposed to do. We gender behaviors, what is acceptable for boys, what is acceptable for girls or men or women. We gender hairstyles. We gender how we are supposed to smell, the kinds of activities we're supposed to do, how we communicate. We just gender all kinds of things. And if you think for a moment back to your childhood and the messages that you were given about your gender and the way it was supposed to be expressed, like girls do this, boys do this, girls aren't supposed to do this, boys aren't supposed to do that. The other piece we know is that because we have a patriarchal society, gendered understandings about what it means to sort of be a full human being tend to be related to that of males and men, and are more highly valued and rewarded. Although there's also more punitive consequences for violating expectations about what it means to be a real man. The other piece about gender in terms of being a social construction is that in our Western society, we generally have two genders, men and women, but that's not true for all societies. Some have 3, 4, 5 or more different designation of gender identity. For example, two-spirited people of some First Nation tribes. But even in our sort of very dualistic, westernized white culture, we still understand that on some level, children are different and that not all of them fit into maybe our standard categories of what it means to be masculine or feminine or a boy or a girl. So some examples, for example, we have a category that we call tomboys, right? For girls. It can be an affectionate term, at least while children are young. And, what is a tomboy but a girl who really doesn't conform entirely to sort of social expectations of what it means to be a little girl? For boys, we have terms like we might call them a mommy's boy or a sissy. Those are derogatory terms. We might say they're a sensitive child to designate a boy that perhaps doesn't fit or conform to gender expectations about what it means to be a little boy. Because there's a huge push to conform that we see over and over again. And what I think is kind of interesting is I think as Mennonites, we have a way of understanding some of that expectation of conforming to gender expectations because Mennonites don't always conform. For example, you think about our sort of cultural understandings of what it means to be a real man. And a lot of that has to do with being aggressive, maybe a warrior type, being kind of an alpha person. But Mennonite maleness is sometimes reflected in terms of being a pacifist, of not embracing a warrior type kind of identity. And many Mennonite men have paid a price for that in terms of social interactions. Or Mennonite women, where in our culture, women are to be very, very feminine and sexualized and sort of wear a lot of makeup and stuff. But in our Anabaptist tradition, we kind of value a certain simplicity, a certain modesty. And so that doesn't kind of conform to social expectations. So I would contend that in some ways, Mennonites are sort of genderqueer in a way, and have a path to understanding more deeply the impact of A, the social construction of gender, and B, what happens when we don't necessarily conform to it. And what I see happening today are, it kind of rose partly out of the feminist movement, but are also challenges to sort of those restrictive gender norms and expectations, as well as an increasing awareness of the diversity and expansiveness of our gender identities. And I see that as kind of an exciting development and offering, because I think we're being invited to see and experience in maybe a more profound and interesting way what it really means to be made in the image of God. It is, for me, if you will, a deeper encounter with God's own body. So I've talked for a long time there. Let's get on to some definitions again. Can move to the next slide. These are some basic terms in this conversation to talk about cisgender, transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender non-binary. You often hear talk about drag queens and sometimes about cross-dressing. So let's get on to that. And the next term, next slide, is cisgender. And by definition, to be cisgender is to be someone whose gender identity is aligned with the sex that has been assigned to them at birth. So for example, if at birth I am assigned as female and my identity, it fits for me as to be a woman, and I may or may not express that generally do express that out in the world. I am a cisgender person. Likewise, and by and large, on some level, most of us feel fairly comfortable with, or like our sex and our gender identity, our gender identity match, and we are cisgender. Next term. Next slide, please. Okay, transgender is a person whose gender identity feels to them very different than that of the sex that was assigned to them at birth. So perhaps if I was assigned female at birth, but that does not fit how I understand who I am in terms of my gender. I may be transgender, and you look at those terms, cis and trans. Cis means to be on the same side of. Trans is to sort of cross over, and so you can see where those terms came from in terms of cis and transgender. Transgender used to be kind of an umbrella term for a lot of gender nonconforming identities, but some of that is beginning to change with time. Next slide, please. Genderqueer. Sometimes genderqueer is known as gender non-binary. As a culture, we are a very binary culture. It's either or. You're either male or female. You're either a man or a woman. You're masculine or feminine. And for genderqueer people or non-binary people, it's like that does not fit my experience of who I am. So my gender isn't defined by exclusively male or female. It may be neither. It may be both. But those terms and expectations just don't fit for me, and we call that being genderqueer. I suggested that maybe Mennonites are a little bit genderqueer, but if you watch and are a fan of Queer Eye, Jonathan Van Ness in Queer Eye. He's the one that does the hair. He's just I think wonderful, playful, loving example of someone who identifies as non-binary. And for Jonathan, the pronouns that he uses are he and his, generally, sometimes they, I think. But in terms of his gender expression, it varies. Sometimes he has a dress on, sometimes he doesn't. I mean, it's just a very, very fluid and wonderful kind of expression. So that's the term genderqueer. Move to the next slide, please. And that is gender fluid, and that's someone whose identity, like it doesn't feel particularly fixed. It's not. Sometimes I feel male. Sometimes I might feel female. Sometimes I feel masculine. Sometimes I feel feminine. That might change from day to day, month to month. It might change in the same day. Sometimes I feel like both. Sometimes I feel like neither. We call that gender fluid. Next slide, please. This is a term we don't hear as much of in terms of cross-dressing, which is really just wearing clothes or kind of cultural items that are generally associated with a different gender. And people increasingly do that with ease, and we can see some wonderful pieces throughout history. Sometimes people have cross-dressed in history to protect themselves, to disguise themselves, sometimes because that was their gender expression. So that is very weak, but we typically don't use that term as much. The next slide, please. Rod, could we, yeah. And this is drag queens or drag kings. Maybe you've been to the, in your experience. I hope you can enjoy one at some point. And this is drag queens, drag kings kind of exaggerate sort of social concepts or masculinity, often for purposes. There's a highly political and sometimes playful nature to drag queens and drag kings. It was sort of begun as this kind of marvelous sort of resistance to, I think, confining gender norms and sort of playing with concepts of gender and gender expression that developed within the queer community. And I think it's a wonderful expression of sort of social commentary, of resistance, satire, and community affirmation. Okay, I'm going to shift here a little bit. I want to show you a video. This comes from a TED Talk. I think it's the best TED Talk that I've ever seen in terms of gender identity, and it talks a lot about gender identity in children. So I'm going to shift to that now. If you could put that on, Rod, for me.
Are you a mommy or a daddy? The little boy called to me one day when I went to pick my youngest son up from the daycare playground. He looked up at me curious, waiting for my answer. But before I answered him, I thought about how many times in my life I've been asked that essential question. Are you a boy or a girl? Sometimes it's actually been more of an accusation, meant to make me feel shame for having an androgynous or ambiguous gender presentation. Sometimes the question's been hurled at me with menace, meant to make me feel unsafe because I've made someone else feel uncomfortable, say in a public restroom. But often, in my role as a pediatrician and as a parent, it's been asked with curiosity, without judgment, a child's genuine attempt to put me into the categories known to them. Now, this little guy was probably about 3 or 4 years old, and I could tell by his tone that he was asking out of curiosity. He genuinely wanted to know which of the 2 adult categories known to him did I fit into? Was I a mommy or a daddy? You see, I look quite a bit like a daddy, but I sound an awful lot like a mommy. So I bent down and I said to him, you know what? I'm not a mommy or a daddy. I'm a mappa. A mappa, he said. What's that? Well, I explained, a mappa is like a mommy and a daddy, both. Oh, okay, he said. So then, what's your favorite dinosaur? And what it took this little guy seconds to accept, it often takes grown-ups a lot longer to unlearn and realize that more exists among human beings than can be answered with the simple question, are you a boy or a girl? Are you a man or a woman? Are you a mommy or a daddy? What I'm here to talk to you about today, as a pediatrician who specializes in caring for transgender and gender diverse kids, as a parent with 3 young kids of my own, and as a person who identifies as both queer and gender diverse, is how kids understand both simple and complex ideas of gender identity, and where the journey that many young transgender and gender diverse kids are on today will ultimately lead all of us. So let's start with how kids understand gender identity. Well, from the age of about 2, kids can understand gender differences. Now, this is mostly based on physical characteristics and anatomy as they sort and put people into categories, boys and girls, mommies and daddies. Kids at 2 are actually very good at putting things into categories, and they're very concrete and binary thinkers. So this is a fun and easy task for them. As they move into age 3 and 4, they then begin to figure out where they fit. They've seen the categories and they're turning the lens inward to discover where they fit in the categories that have been explained to them, most of which are boy and girl. Now, they often develop more sophisticated understanding of physical characteristics and anatomy around this time, and they're often not shy about sharing their discoveries with us. They may exclaim, "I'm a girl and I have a vagina." And that may happen in the pediatrician's office or in the checkout line at the grocery store. They have figured out their place in the world and they are claiming it. It shouldn't surprise you then that some transgender kids are also claiming their identities as young as 3 and 4 years old. They know the categories, they know how they should feel inside based on their anatomy, and they also know that the way that they see themselves doesn't line up with other people's expectations. From as young as some kids can talk, they're explaining to their parents the truth about their identities. Now, as kids move beyond into the age of 4 and 5, they're starting to figure out gender role, or what does it mean to be a boy or a girl? This is when kids are understanding how they should act based on their gender identities, and they're learning about concepts like boys' toys and girls' toys for the first time, which even if we don't teach it to them, all it takes is one trip to Target to figure out which toys belong to who. And so they're first figuring out what do they like. They're trying on different ways of dressing, different costumes. They're doing pretend and imaginary play. They're playing with different types of toys. They're figuring out first what they like, and then is it okay or not? And this can actually be a hard time for all kids, not just kids who are transgender and gender diverse, as they first figure out what they love, and then they figure out might they be punished in big or small ways for being themselves. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm a parent, and I have 3 boys, or rather I have 3 kids, 6, 6, and 4, who were assigned male at birth and continue to identify as boys. And when our kids were growing up, we tried to expand their gender categories just a little bit. So instead of saying to them, these are boy parts and these are girl parts, we taught them that most boys have penises and most girls have vaginas, just to leave open the possibility that biology isn't destiny, and that how someone feels inside or their gender identity may not line up with expectations based on anatomy. They actually adapted quite quickly to this, and I remember the day that one of my sons came up to me and he said, "Mappa, I'm a most boy." I thought, tell me just a little bit more about that. Well, he said, you know how most boys have penises, but some boys don't? I'm a boy that has a penis. I'm a most boy. Fair enough, I thought. And yet, despite our attempt to expand gender categories a little bit for my kids, and despite them growing up with a parent who goes by the name of Mappa and who identifies as non-binary, my own kids still brought these gender expectations home with them. I remember one day when my son Theo, he's the beaming, smiling child here in the blue princess dress. I remember when he came home from daycare one day with that exact dress in his backpack. And he said to me, "Mappa, I don't want to bring this dress for show and tell anymore." Now, you can tell by this picture how much Theo loves that dress, and he used to love dressing up in costume, and I could tell it made him feel a little bit sad. So I said, "Theo, tell me why." Well, he explained, one of my friends and one of my teachers told me that boys don't wear dresses. Oh, I said, okay. Well, Theo, do you remember when we talked about that clothes are for everyone and toys are for everyone? In our family, you can wear whatever clothes you want. In our family, it's okay for boys to wear dresses. Now, in some families, boys might not get to wear dresses, but those aren't the rules in our house, and that's not the rules in our family. I know, he said. I just don't want to anymore. And you know what? He never did. And not only did he never bring that princess dress for show and tell anymore, he really stopped dressing up and playing princess after that. And was it because at 4.5, he was ready to be done dressing up as a princess and playing pretend? Maybe. Or was it because he was worried that if he brought that dress back to show and tell again and violated the rules of being a boy, that he might be punished for that? Maybe. I'll never know the answer to that for sure. But what we do know is that by the time most kids are 6 and 7 years old, they are conforming into traditional gender roles. What I mean by that is that girls are becoming more feminine, boys are becoming more masculine. They're starting to conform their hairstyles, the way they dress, the toys they play with, their peer groups, to what society expects of them based on their gender identities. Now, is this because naturally boys and girls are different? Or is this because our society has very strict expectations of how boys and girls should act based on their identities? The research would tell us that it's probably some of both. And honestly, we'll probably never know the answer to that question for sure. But here's one thing that we do know. What we do know is that kids who violate our expectations around gender are punished for doing so. What we know is that 80% of transgender and gender diverse kids experience harassment in schools. In fact, we know that the #1 reason that kids are bullied in school is for gender nonconforming dress or behavior. Those girls who are too masculine or boys who are too feminine, regardless of their underlying sexual orientation or gender identity. We know that up to 60% of transgender kids are rejected by their parents, and that the disruption of this fundamental attachment has devastating consequences for their self-esteem. One of those consequences being that in some studies, trans and gender diverse kids are 8 to 9 times more likely to try to take their own life. And we also know that the world is changing. We know that in 2016, in the state of Minnesota, when we asked 9th and 11th graders to describe their gender identities to us, that 2.8% of them, or nearly 3%, identified as transgender and gender nonconforming. That's close to 3 times what we've previously found in adult studies. We also know that we're hearing new words and new language to describe gender identity all the time, mostly from the young people in our lives. Words like genderqueer, gender expansive, gender fluid, non-binary, bigender, agender, and on and on. We know that kids today are discovering their gender identities now more than ever, and they're finding new language and new models to share those identities with us. So you're thinking, I get it. This is a trend. This is a fad. This is cool. This is the next new thing, and my kid, and the kid in my kid's class, and the neighbor kid, and actually, maybe even you, Dr. Gepford. You're part of this new wave, this cool trend of being transgender and gender diverse. Hold that thought for just a second. Let's go back to those 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, the ones I was telling you about early on, the ones who are learning about gender categories and they're grabbing at words and language for the first time to describe that to others. Do you know what else those kids are learning how to do? Do you know what else they love to do? They are learning how to color. And they, in fact, love to color. And what if, when our 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds were learning how to color, what if we reached into our pocket and we pulled out 2 crayons, pink and blue, and we said, draw us a picture of who you are. Draw us all who you imagine yourself to be, but we'd like you to do it with just 1 crayon, pink or blue. No, I'm sorry, you actually can't choose both. You have to pick one, pink or blue. Imagine all the pictures we would never see. Imagine all the vividness and color that kids could imagine themselves to be and that they see reflected back to them in the world. Imagine all that we would miss. And now imagine if we handed them this. Imagine if we handed them a box of 64 crayons, and instead of saying pick one, we said, pick as many as you would like. Show us who you are. Tell us all the stories. Pick one for a while that's your favorite, and then pick another one, and then go back to your original favorite. If you can imagine it, then you can draw it. It is my foundational belief that we all know who we are from a very young age, including the truest expression of our gender identity. And we actually spend most of our lives searching for the words and the tools and the safety and the agency to share ourselves with the world. Queer author and activist Leslie Feinberg said, "Gender is the poetry we write with the language we are taught." Gender is the poetry we write with the language we are taught. If we give kids the language, if we open the box of crayons for us, they will tell us who they are. So no, I don't think that this is a trend or a fad. I think that this is the revealing of a truth that has always existed. And kids can't draw the truth of themselves with just one crayon. Child advocate Marian Wright Edelman said, "Kids cannot become that which they cannot see." And kids today are seeing more and more LGBTQ folks, people like me, people like the actors and actresses on this screen, more than ever before. We are giving them a bigger box of crayons, and they are actually drawing for us more imaginative pictures of what it means to be a boy or a girl or something in between than many of us can ever remember. And so what is our job as parents, as pediatricians, as aunts, uncles, grandparents, friends, neighbors, teachers? Our job is to listen. Our job is to ask interesting questions and then listen for the answer. Who are you? What do you like? What makes you feel like you? And when kids begin to show themselves to us, we support them without steering. We reveal our own gender identities. We ask and share names and pronouns. We give them all the examples of what it means to be a boy or a girl or transgender or something in between. What I've learned in my role as a pediatrician for the last 15 years and as a pediatrician who specializes in the care of transgender and gender diverse kids is that these kids don't need me to figure them out. They need me to listen, to really listen, and to help them amplify the voice that's inside them. They don't actually need me to diagnose them. They need me to help them be heard. And when these kids begin to show themselves to us, when they start down that brave journey of self-discovery, we remind them that they are beautiful and strong and resilient. And most importantly, we love them. We fully and fiercely and wholeheartedly love them. And if we do this, our kids will draw for us the most beautiful pictures of who they are. They will write for us the beautiful poetry of their identities. And in doing this, they will expand the world of gender. And not just for them, but for all of us. Because how many of us were given just 2 crayons to choose from, but longed for a bigger box? How many of us were never given the right tools or language to describe our own identities? You see, in loving and supporting transgender and gender diverse kids, we're not only helping them be more free and true versions of themselves, we're helping all of us have the language we need to discover ourselves. Leslie Feinberg also said, "My right to be me is tied with 1,000 threads to your right to be you." Because after all, we all deserve a bigger box of crayons. Thank you.
That is such a wonderfully powerful video. And so I want to end my presentation with just a few questions for you to ponder in the days and weeks ahead. And I hope that you have conversations about them too. So the first question, and this comes from the video that I think you were invited to watch before the session. The question of does it matter to you what gender I am, and why or why not? The next slide, please. To think about what your box of crayons looked like as you were growing up. How many choices did you have to express really who you were and are, and what you're about, and what you loved, and what your own sense of your identity was? What did your box of crayons look like as you were growing up? And then finally, the last slide. What are ways that Portland Mennonite can offer to everyone a bigger and more vibrant box of crayons? What are the things that you can do as a congregation to help develop beautiful, strong, resilient people who know that they and understand that they are loved in the way of God? So if we could go back to the regular screen and have some time for questions and maybe comments.